Hopefully that's working. Richard, are you going to confirm? But I expect we're okay.
Yes, yeah, it's working, Joe.
Okay, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back for the second of my talks. If you were here last week, and also you may have caught a talk earlier on this evening. I just caught the one from Buckfast Abbey, which was very interesting. Right, I'll outline where we're going from here. This is roughly what we're going to cover tonight. I'm going to try and just have ask a few rhetorical questions about local or native, because we get very confused by those. Who can benefit from the National Bee Improvement Programme? Look at commercial beekeepers, what their role might be in this programme, working in groups, which is a good option for many of us. Quick mention of local adaptation, because it's a word we bandy around and just want a little definition. Probably the most important aspect of bee improvement, drones and the mating of queens. We've always regarded that as a bit of a stumbling block, and it always has been the big problem with breeding of bees or bee improvement. And then we'd look at, does the system work? And I'll outline why I think it does. And that's basically it. Okay, so now as beekeepers, we can just go off and do our own thing. It can be a pretty solitary activity, and it can be very enjoyable for that reason, but it's also nice when you have help. But we've got to remember that although we might be alone when we're doing our beekeeping, our bees are part of a bigger picture. They're part of the local population, and they're breeding with the local population. Basically, the queen is mating with numerous drones from the area. So we affect others with our bees and others affect us. We're not an island. So we are part of the bigger picture. And the National Bee Improvement Programme, we want as many beekeepers to participate as possible to try and improve the quality of that bee population. It's been a bit of a free-for-all up to now. We just seem to have ended up in a bit of a mess, really, with a very hybridized population. And we've got to look at it and think, how on earth can we move forward from this situation and try and enjoy something better? We may have to work together with others, and that's probably what the bit about working in groups is mainly about. But right. So just to recap, quick recap, because some of you have seen the talks before and some of you might be new to it, and that's always tricky. But set up the National Bee Improvement Programme was set up by BIBBA as a programme to sustainably improve our bees, and it's got a joint aim of reducing our imports, because we think that's not only is that a biosecurity risk to our bees, we might import something nasty. It has happened before, but also it takes its toll on the genetics of our bees by mixing up all the different subspecies. It makes it hard for us to really select and improve our bees. So if we could reduce imports whilst trying to get to grips with the quality of our bees, I think we could start to make progress. And the secret of the programme is to start with the bees we already have. So that's easy, because we've all got bees in and around us. They're the ones to work on. And from those bees, we've got to try and select something that's worth rearing a next generation from. And the way we do that is by keeping a record of bees' performance. I'll show you a record card later on. You can do whatever record card you like. You can design your own. You can use this one that's provided by BIBBA, or you can modify this one in any way you want. And we all got slightly different views of what we're looking for in our bees, perhaps. So we all might want to do it slightly differently, and that's perfectly acceptable. So the aim is to improve the bees and reduce the imports. And there's going to be a minimum rules, because every time we make a rule, it's going to rule out some beekeepers. They're either going to say, well, I can't do that, or I don't want to do that. And that's going to rule out a few more beekeepers. So the less rules, the better, then everyone's included. But there is one rule, which is straight away going to rule out some beekeepers. But we had to do it because it really does set back the program every time, set back the improvement every time it happens. And the one rule is do not use imported or the offspring of recently imported bees. Don't run away if you're importing bees, or if there's still a place for you, and I'll try and explain how in a little while. And I know that large numbers of bee farmers import bees, not all of them by any means, but many do, and many do well with the system. So we'll be talking about that a bit more in a bit more detail. So you'll hear me talking about use the bees in our area. You'll hear me talking about local, and you'll hear me talking about native. And some people think they only want native. Some only want local and don't want native, and vice. And being beekeepers, we like to be pretty detailed about what our likes and dislikes, and we like to all have a slightly different point of view, which is tricky because this program is designed to get as many people involved as possible. So you've got to bear with it, and you can pick and choose exactly what you want, basically. And as long as you try to avoid new stock all the time, because that bringing new genes into the area that haven't been tested makes life difficult for selecting and improving. So most of our bees are very mixed in terms of subspecies. They're a mixture of subspecies. And I sort of outlined that last week. And there are about 28 subspecies in the world. And we have our own North Europe has its own subspecies, Apis mellifera mellifera, but we've imported many others, particularly Ligurian and Carniolan or Carnica. Or Ligustico, I didn't realise they were different, but anyway, yeah, apparently they are. I just heard that on the webinar from Buckfast Abbey. Anyway, so our resources of bees vary considerably in different areas. So we're all starting from a different point. I mean, this is a pie chart that was drawn up a few years ago, taking random samples from around the country, and they DNA analysed it to find out what these different bits were. And they found out that our native subspecies is probably, on average, is about that much, about 45%. But which was a big surprise because I've often been led to believe they're not around anymore. Anyway, beekeepers' attitudes vary as well towards bees, and they've all got different ideas. Some relate to local, others to native. I'm really just going to ask some rhetorical questions to get you thinking about it, but as far as I'm concerned, you've got what you've got in your area, and that's what you've got to start with. So at what point does imported bees become local? How many generations does it take? I don't know the answer, but these are rhetorical questions, as I say, but they're things to think about. And how long does it take for a local bee to become a native bee? Can it become like our original subspecies, or will it always have some genes from the other subspecies? And that's where we get the definition of near-natives, presumably. They're probably largely this section with a few other genes thrown in from other subspecies. So in that bit, we're not saying you've got to do this, you've got to do that, but it's an attempt to get beekeepers going in the same direction. And that's what it boils down to, really. Can we get everybody working in the same way by starting with what they've got? I can't read that. So our native subspecies, that's the one, Apis mellifera mellifera. It's important from a conservation point of view. And it's not just me saying that, it's people like the Collos group who really were worried about the loss of subspecies around Europe. And that we've tended to pick two that beekeepers pick two that they really like, the Italian and the Carniolan, and tended to take them all around the world and do well with them. And they've infiltrated all the other subspecies. And we're losing these genetic resources. And they're important for reasons of biodiversity. We never know when we're going to need the diversity that might come in useful. You know, the more diversity you've got, the more secure your population is. And from bee improvement point of view, or from bee breeding, shall we say, pure strains are considered important. Bee breeders often say you need to stick to one strain to get any decent results, any reliable results. And even people who like crossing different subspecies to get the hybrid vigor, they like to cross one pure strain with another. But we start from where we are, and that BIP encourages beekeepers to select and improve their bees regardless of their starting position. And I think that's how it can apply to all of us, really. And we believe that without constant flow of imports, we can actually make progress through natural and artificial selection. If you were here last week, you'll know what I mean by those. Natural selection is what we all know, survival of the fittest. Nature selects the ones that survive. And the beekeeper selects for the qualities he or she wants. By combining those two selection principles, we can get a bee that's in harmony with nature, and yet it's got the qualities some qualities that we want as well, because we are a partnership, the bee and the beekeeper, and we want what's good for both of us, not just what's good for one of us. Right, who can benefit? Who should participate? Well, prospective beekeepers who haven't got any bees yet, my advice is to try and obtain local or native bees rather than imports. Probably when you're a prospective beekeeper, you may not even be aware that there's lots of different subspecies and lots of them are being imported that aren't native to this country. It's been shown that local bees perform better. They survive better for sure than imports. So that's a good place to start. Small beekeepers can work alone, or they can work together to form an improvement group with other beekeepers to get more influence. And I'll be looking at how that can benefit and how it can be done. And then there's medium and large scale beekeepers, commercial beekeepers. They are really important to the beekeeping world because their bees have a big influence on the bees in their area because they've got so many. What they choose is going to affect all the bees in their area. So it's important for them to get involved as well. So how do we involve commercial beekeepers? It is a tricky one. Many of them rely on a system of regularly importing queens. Not all. Many are sympathetic to the ideas in this National Bee Improvement Programme, but there's a lot that have their system of importing queens and it works well for them. They get high yields of honey. It keeps them financially viable, which is important if you're running a business. They rely on the high yields and they get them. So even commercial beekeepers who are sympathetic to the ideas of the National Bee Improvement Programme, they can't really, or they're afraid to step off the treadmill of importing bees regularly, because if their yields go down, their business is going to be threatened and they're going to be out of a job. So how do we get around this issue? Well, I think the way forward is a bit like what many organic farmers did. When they converted to organic farming, they quite liked the ideas of better for the environment and better food quality and so on. But they didn't like the idea of risking everything. So they converted part of their farm or part of their holding initially to organic farming to see how it went. And then gradually many of them went more and more organic because they found it worked. And this is the same thing we'd like to see with commercial beekeepers, really. They could commit part of their enterprise to working the same principles, selecting and improving what they've got and keeping away from the rest of their holding. So it's a geographical area, and perhaps they could work with other beekeepers. They could help beekeepers in small scale beekeepers or groups of beekeepers who are in the same area, and they could all devote an area to establishing a local strain. And as the strain gets established and the qualities start to improve, the yields are going to improve and everything's going to be good. And then nothing has been lost and a lot has been gained. So we think we don't know how many bee farmers are sympathetic to using local bees, but we know that quite a few are. My estimate is that, but I've no idea if that's anything like realistic or not. But more could be encouraged to join in by setting aside a percentage of their enterprise to the NatBIBBA system. They could choose a geographically isolated area, possibly to tie in with local NatBIBBA or bee improvement group. Imported stock would not be used in this area. They would merely select from what they got left, what survives and what does well. So if they wanted to rear queens from any of their surviving stock, they choose the ones that were doing well, performing well, and gradually improve. It could be viewed by bee farmers as a trial run, and it could present business opportunities. There's always going to be opportunities selling local bees. Lots of people want them now. Lots of beekeepers want them, and it might open up other business opportunities. It's worth considering. Right. Let's talk about how we can work in groups, because small scale beekeepers, perhaps with something like 5 colonies average, how are they going to influence things? Well, advantage of working in a group is that you get a load of beekeepers together, they've all got some bees between them. So between you, the numbers start to add up. You've got much more beekeeping stock to assess and select. So between you, you've got more chance of finding something worth breeding from, shall we say. The more stock you've got to look at, the more chance of being something half decent. There's some beekeepers with spare equipment. You can share equipment. You can share skills and experience. So that's good. It might be someone who's been beekeeping for a long time and others that have just been doing it for a year or two. But between you, you can work together and all do good. Share the workload of rearing queens, etc. And that is quite a tie. It's a big job. Plenty of people haven't got the time, or they feel they haven't got the time. But if you're in a group, you can all take your turn and what have you, and it just eases the workload. And the idea is that between you, you can get a system going where you get more effective mating of queens. That is, you can produce more good drones in the area. And I'll talk about how we're going to achieve that in a minute. If you do form a group, it might be an informal group, it might be formal. They both have their advantages. Informal, you just get together and just get on with it. Formal group starts making rules, having a constitution, but the idea of that is usually for finance and funding. And then you can get funds in and it just helps with purchasing equipment and so on. So there's advantage to both forms. And on the NatBIBBA guide, which is on the BIBBA site, you'll be able to read about a few guides to how to form a successful group. Right, now then, Now you can go to your local association and talk to your fellow beekeepers and talk to them about this National Bee Improvement Programme. What you find in local associations, if it's anything like mine, no disrespect, some people won't be bothered. They can't be bothered with this. Others will probably be opposed to it. There's always going to be some opposition, some apathy. But some associations work very well together, and they just work all together and they agree on it and get on with it. If you find that you have got a problem with these things, then you've just got to work with the like-minded beekeepers, and that's how I did it in my local group. I talked to them about it, and some of them expressed an interest. The ones that express an interest, you work with, and gradually you gather around a whole load of beekeepers who are quite keen to work together. If possible, get an involvement of a local bee farmer as well. That'll help enormously. Can make a big difference in increasing influence and developing a local strain. These are the things we're aiming for, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And most important of all, developing a successful mating area or apiary area. I mean, it might be your local association apiary, for example, or it might be somewhere completely different where you think you can find a space away from someone who is influencing the drones in an area that isn't conducive to what you're trying to do. Local or native, use natural and artificial selection to start moving the way you want to go. Now, with these like-minded beekeepers, you've got to get together and you've got to reach some sort of agreement. You've got to decide on the aims of the group and the qualities you want to achieve. Now, that might sound difficult, but actually nearly all beekeepers want roughly the same thing. There might be some variation, but I guarantee nearly everyone will start with good-tempered bees. Temperament is important. And although I've heard beekeepers say that they don't care what the temper's like, the majority want good-tempered bees. It's so much more pleasant to work with. You've got to agree on a record card. Why do you need a record card? So that you can assess each colony and decide which one is worth breeding from, or which ones are worth breeding from, and which ones perhaps the queens need replacing. That's really important. And when I started, I got together with some beekeepers and we thought, right, we're going to start queen rearing. I mean, this was quite a long time ago and we didn't have much idea. We thought, right, we'll get this queen rearing organised. Oh, hang on a minute, we haven't got a clue what to rear queens from, because we hadn't got a record card, we hadn't assessed any of our colonies. So that's where you start. How are you going to rear queens? You've got to decide on the method. I'm not going to talk about queen rearing tonight, but it is a crucial part of it. Some of you may already have done some queen rearing, so that might be a good place to start. You've probably already found methods that they like. And they don't have to be complicated. They can be as simple as, I think I taught last week. I don't know, I've given so many talks lately. I don't know what I've said to who, but a very simple method to build up a colony on 2 brood boxes from the spring onwards. And the queen will be laying in both brood boxes. You move the queen away in one box to a few yards to one side. All the flying bees will come back and join the queenless colony on the original site. And you can shuffle brood around if you like. So there's eggs and young larvae in that. Make sure there's eggs and young larvae in it. And they will be queenless, so they'll rear new queen cells to quickly find a replacement queen. And that's as simple as that, really. Or you can do, my favorite method is I use the queen right method of queen rearing, which is on the MBU website. It's what they apparently use. Again, you use 2 brood boxes, queen in both, and then the queen is access to both, and then you come along and sort them all out and put the queen down below a queen excluder. You shuffle the frames around. I'm not going to give you all the details, but the top box then seems to act as if it's queenless, and you can, if you want to do grafting, you put a load of grafts in there and they will rear queen cells, and that works very well for us. And what reason we like it is because the colony stays queen-right all the time, and so they're happy. You don't have to have a spell of queenlessness where their temper might get a bit, and the stress might get a bit much. It's a lot of work rearing queens, so that's why it's great in a group. You can all join in, chip in and do some work. But when you've reared the cells, and it's not that much work, I'm afraid there's more work to come, because it's even more work finding homes for all the queens you've reared. And you suddenly find, oh goodness, I've got 15 queen cells there, and you've got to find 15 homes, and that could be a lot of work. But it doesn't matter, you get systems going, and you already make preparations for what you're going to do with all these queen cells. And these are some things that work better in a group. And then how are you going to mate the queens? Now that's a crucial question, because what they mate with is half the story. And that's traditionally been thought of as a stumbling block. And I'll try and run through that in a minute, how we're going to get some better results, get some more reliable results. But my advice, when we started, we had about, I suppose we had 8 to 10 people initially who were really keen to join in. And if you get more, it's even better, because you've got the more bee population, bigger numbers of bees, more colonies to look at and check out. Trouble is, 8 or 10 people crowding around a hive to do queen rearing is a nightmare. So what you want to do is split into smaller groups. Perhaps 3 or 4 is an ideal little team, and then everybody can get more actively involved. If you've got 8 or 10 in a big group, you'll find 2 people doing all the work, and the rest just sitting around, still standing around and looking, but getting a bit bored in actual fact, because they can't do anything. But if there's in small groups, they can really get actively involved, and they have to get actively involved, so that you've all got to check everyone knows what they're doing, and it works well. Right, so we've got our group of beekeepers who are dead keen. We've got to now think about, right, what are we going to use? Have we got any decent bees in this area? And there will be some, and they might not be, they might be, it depends how good, they vary a lot, but you can find the ones you like. Find the best colonies in your area. And record keeping is how you work out which are the best, which are worth breeding from, and perhaps which queens you want to replace because they're really nasty tempered or something like that, or the colony is extremely prone to chalk brood, for example. You might want to get rid of her for that reason. And as I said the other day, we've got a whole spectrum of beekeepers, from extreme natural beekeeper to extreme commercial beekeeper. We've got the whole range and everybody else in between. But I think all beekeepers really are looking for some qualities in their bees. I mean, you're not going to be very happy if your bees are incredibly aggressive and want to sting everybody in the area. That's not good. So it's something, that's a quality you will be looking for, something that's a bit more placid. You might have a colony that's really riddled with chalk brood. You might be looking for a bit better health. So, these are sort of minimum qualities that you want. I mean, you as a group have to decide what other qualities you're looking for. And the idea of avoiding imports and offspring, there's 2 main reasons really, I'd say. And one is the biosecurity risks they're representing, and they're threatening our bees because they might bring in something else that our bees perhaps haven't seen before, and it could do a lot of damage. And the other thing is the genetic thing. If you bring in bees from some other climate, they've never seen what we're offering them. The genes aren't used to these conditions. So what's the point in bringing in new genes to be tested in a new environment when you've got plenty of genes already, which which are already being tested, and you can already find the best ones that are around. So we get back to this system of natural and artificial selection, and it's what we do from our record card. We can soon pick out the ones we like. I mean, you might get together as a group, you might think, well, all we're interested in really is the bees are healthy and the bees are nice-tempered. Well, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you decide, if that's what your group decides it wants. When we formed our group, we decided on a few more things than that, but the fewer things you go for, the easier it is to achieve, basically. So don't go for about 20 items, because you'll never get there. Working within a strain might be one of your things. It might not. You might think, well, what's the point in that? But it's called working within a framework, within limits. And for me, that's quite important, because I think that the selection improvement process works better if the bees are a bit alike, basically. And you tend to, if you breed bees from a uniform colony, you tend to get offspring which is a bit like the parents. There will be variability, of course, and that's how you make progress in bee improvement, by the variability and by keep picking the better ones. Some people might not want to think that. They just want to pick what's best in their area. They might be, well, most of us start from very mixed stock and have to make do with it. Whether we refine that into a less mixed thing or not is up to us. There's definitely advantages to doing it, but you might think, no, we don't want to do that, and we're not going to bother. So if you're working on your own, not in a group, you're still able to select your queens. You can propagate from your best colony, if you like. And so you've got control over 50% of the genes, or your best colonies in the plural. Might be one of the better ones, the top half, if you like. But you've got control over 50% of the genes, but you obviously a bit no control over the drones they're mating with. Never mind, that's a start, and you can still make progress in that respect. But most of us want to do a bit better than that, so that's the reason for working together and thinking about how we can influence the male line. First thing is to choose your breeder queens. Some people don't like that phrase. I think it's too complicated sounding. It's a breeder queen is merely a queen you're going to rear one or more queens from for the next generation. So this is the card. This is a card that's on offer on the BIBBA website. It's designed to suit the qualities that our group went for, and it might not suit everything you want to go for, but it doesn't matter because it's available as a PDF or in a Word, so you can adjust it to suit yourselves. You can say, well, I don't care about native appearance, I'll scrap that off, and I'll put something else in there or whatever. These dark grey ones are the 5 qualities that we go for in our group, and we think that works quite well. If you heard the talk before from Claire and Martin, that was on just an hour or two before us, they said some qualities are much more responsive, if you like, to selection and improvement than others. And they reckon swarming was pretty low down the list. It's quite a hard one to achieve. But nevertheless, these are what we're aiming for. We're aiming for the native strain, because that's the framework we're trying for. So we think we can then progress faster in selection improvement. You might have other ideas. We're aiming for good temperament. We want bees that are really pleasant to work with, not a danger to ourselves or the general public, basically. And we think that's a really important trait. We're trying to get bees that are a bit less swarmy. They're less inclined to swarm, so they can go through the whole season, produce a decent crop of honey and not attempt to swarm. And we mark them assess them according to their attempts to swarm. So if you go in April, you're not likely to see any attempt to swarm, so you don't bother giving them a mark. Everything's marked out of 5, by the way, 1 to 5, 5 being the top mark. So if they're really pleasant to work with, you give them 5. Brood pattern and health. A colony that's healthy and the queen lays a good brood pattern, you'll find that colony will expand more rapidly than the rest. So it's quite a nice quality to have. So we tend to mark that. If we see that, we mark it. If we don't notice it, like if we see a load of chalk brood in there, for example, we'd mark it down. It depends on how much, it'd probably get 2 or 1, score of 2 or 1. We wouldn't want to breed from something like that. We'd breed from something that was healthy and the queen had a good brood pattern. We record how much honey we get from the bees because we like them to be productive. Your group might decide, oh, we don't care about that, let's not bother with that one or whatever. So it's a free-for-all basically. But we feel, what is the common ground? We feel the common ground is if we all stop bringing in new stuff, we'll be choosing the bees that do best in our area, whatever qualities we may have selected. And they're the ones that do well for us. And they're the ones we want. And that's the first step in developing a better bee for everybody in Britain and Ireland, basically. So I'm not going to run through in detail, but we are hoping to do a video in April of going through a colony and assessing it for different qualities. And you'll see how it wants to be quite short, just so you quickly get the idea of what we're doing. And it's easier than explaining the theory now. You'll be able to see a practical version. That's the idea anyway. Right. What is local adaptation? Now, it's become a real good catchphrase. Everybody wants locally adapted bees now. And everybody started saying they've got locally adapted. There was a bee farmer the other day. He regularly brings in buckfast bees. What type of bees does he keep? Locally adapted buckfast. I mean, I didn't understand that. Anyway, there's the definition. Local adaptation is where a population of organisms evolves to be more well suited to its local environment than other members of the same species that live elsewhere. So just through natural selection, or if they're beekeepers involved through natural and artificial selection, the bee becomes more adapted. It's going to cope better. It's the ones that cope well with local conditions. Local conditions might be what the beekeeper's doing to the bees as well. So species naturally do this. If they're not, if they're geographically isolated, and obviously that bees are to some extent, we're all in different regions and so on, different conditions. Well, another name for this is ecotypes. That's something you come across quite a lot. It's well known in ecology. And it happens just by not keep bringing in new stock into the local environment, basically. And so then you can pick and choose the bees that do best in that environment. That's the idea of it. Right. Now then, unfortunately, I can't see what that says, but I think it's probably something like something in the way of it. That's the trouble. I think it's something to do with mating of the queens, perhaps. It's crucial to progress in bee improvement. How do we dominate an area with good drones? Now, this has traditionally been the stumbling block. Everyone says, well, you can't, bee improvement's a waste of time. You just got to leave it to people who can do artificial or instrument insemination or have got an isolated mating apiary. So that's what the experts would have told us. And well, that's fact what Brother Adam probably would have told us, because he used an isolated mating apiary on Dartmoor for his matings, so he could get good stock. But obviously, over time, he farmed out his queen rearing to other people. He provided the breeding stock, but let them do it places where they could get this isolated mating. And that was always thought to be crucial to obviously it's crucial to bee breeding. So how can we as lowly beekeepers do anything different? Well, there are some factors that work in our favour, I believe. Don't forget, honeybees are native to Britain and Ireland, and they're used to our cool, unsettled weather. We think, oh, the warmer places are better for queen rearing. Maybe they are, but our bees have managed to survive in Britain perfectly well. Before we started importing things, they could cope with our climatic conditions, and they are quite happy to mate in our cool, unsettled weather. And I think that's a factor that works in our favour, because if we keep selecting local bees, we're going to be selecting the ones that actually can mate in it with the conditions we've got. They aren't going to be relying on a totally good summer to get their mating sorted out. Queens and drones fly in cooler conditions. They certainly do. We certainly believe they do with the native subspecies. It's also believed, as Claire and Martin pointed out from some report, they read, they'll fly at different mating heights, and they'll fly at different times of the day, possibly to other subspecies. So whatever the reasons, also there's this thing called apiary vicinity mating, which we think plays a big part with the native subspecies. In other words, they don't rely on fine settled weather for a drone congregation area to form so that the queen can go out and mate. Whatever the mechanisms, and I'm not scientifically, I haven't scientifically proved any of this, but I have observed what happens. I've observed that the native bees seem to, on the whole, they mate with the native bees, not completely, unfortunately. Right, continued. Right, so how are we going to get some decent matings for our bees? Well, identify a suitable area. What might that be? Well, it might be, because of the topography, hills and valleys, mountains if you've got them, and bodies of water. Whatever you've got, you might live in a place that's flat as a pancake, but some areas there might be less beekeepers than others, or you might have to get all the beekeepers on side with what you're doing. So it may be a low bee population, or it may be one with beekeepers or bee farmers on your side wanting to do the same thing as you. And that might be what it comes down to. The more apiaries or colonies around the mating site, the better, because you can pick and choose. If you're a group, you can pick and choose to a large extent what those apiaries and colonies are, or at least hopefully get the beekeepers who are really not bothered about doing anything, at least not keep bringing in new bees to the area, which brings in new untested drones to the area. So this is what we heard the other day on a talk. The more colonies producing drones, the better it is. The fewer colonies producing drones, so it's better than it's better than, say, 4 colonies producing all the drones. If you can get numerous colonies producing drones, the better. How are we going to get them all producing good drones? I'll tell you in a minute. Results in colonies, the reason for this is that there's more, the mother's the same of all the bees, but the different fathers, so the different families or half families within the colony producing genetically diverse colonies, which are thought to do a lot better than ones that aren't like that. So let's get on to this key to really good matings. And some people say the key is the drones, but really the key is actually the breeder queens you choose. The key is the queens you rear from these queens, because you know these are good because you've done the assessments and they're good. So then the drones are presumably going to be good because the drones are produced from unfertilized eggs. So all the daughters you rear from breeder queens, that is from a good breeder queen, are going to produce good drones. Because because whatever these daughters mate with, it makes no difference to the drones. That's the point about it. So even if the first generation will mate with every drone in the area, and the workers might look very mixed indeed, but the drones will be directly related to your breeder queens. And that is the key to getting better results from the male line. So we need to identify an area to do this in order to develop a local strain. That is an area we can dominate with our drones. Some places are going to find it, some beekeepers are going to find it easier than others, depending on what the areas like. You may have to travel, you may have to set up a mating area in a different area from where you usually do your beekeeping. Who knows? Work together to achieve the aims. And what I did was select an area, and I kept rearing. Every year I'd rear daughter queens, and these daughter queens would head up the colonies the next year, and they would be putting out good drones. And any colonies you've got that don't seem right, or aren't good tempered, for example, you move out of the area, out of the breeding area, and you keep bringing in new ones from your breeder queens each year, and gradually get more and more uniformity until you start getting more reliable results. It may take a little time, but it may not. It just depends how fortunate you are really with the area. This is it diagrammatically, in case that was a bit unclear. Choose some breeder queens. The more the merrier, really, because then you've got more diversity. 3 is the picture, but this just represents a number of breeder queens. And this represents a number of offspring, any number. Now these offspring, it'll be in nukes at first, and then they'll be in colonies. And in year 2, they'll be producing drones. So when you select a load more breeder queens in year 2, this is perhaps your group, or if you can include a bee farmer, friendly bee farmer with it as well, that'd be even better because you get more colonies in the system. So you rear, this is another load of breeder queens. They're nothing to do with those lot. They might be completely unrelated. And you're rearing queens, but they're all good. You've selected them through your record system. And you've reared a lot more queens, not just 8, but loads of them. And these queens will go out to mate. They're in their nukes or mini nukes to start with. And these drones from the big colonies that you reared last year will now mate with these. So you're already increasing chances of getting a good mating. And you repeat that the following year. So this lot are going to put out drones directly related to your breeder queens, and they'll mate with those queens. And you just keep doing it until things get better and better. And some years will be good, and some years will be not so good, if it's anything like what I experienced. And some years you think, goodness, why aren't these very good this year? And then you realise someone who's up the road has brought a couple of broadcast colonies into your area or something like that. And there's usually a reason for it. But all in all, you keep persevering and it gets better and better. And that's dominating an area. So select an area that you can dominate with good drones. Area might be defined by topography, water bodies, or low population, including low beekeeping population. There may be mechanisms, as I said, that favour, in my case, I'm selecting the native bee purely because I think it's easier. I'm all in favour of doing the easy route. Native drones and queens may mate in cooler areas. Apiary vicinity mating may be more popular in poor weather, particularly. This is one of my apiaries. So I'd have several apiaries around the mating area. So these are all putting out good drones. In the spring, I'll go through all these colonies and I'll weed out any I don't like. Right, the offspring seem to be quite yellow. She was a daughter of a breeder queen, for example. She was a daughter of a breeder queen, so I know she's all right, and the drones will actually be all right, but I might prefer to get her out of the way before the next generation comes on. Say if my swarm control doesn't come up to scratch and this swarms, then I might have trouble in the next generation. But anyway, another reason might be that just the quality of them. They might have chalk brood, or they might, the temper of these isn't too good, and these are all lovely. So I'll keep them in the area. And, you know, if you're working with others, you can hopefully get several apiaries running with fairly decent bees in them. And they're all going to be putting out good drones. Now, you can do things to increase the drone production if you want. I don't, because I find it easier to let them produce however many they want. And I'm fortunate to have quite a lot of colonies in this area with good bees. And the other beekeepers in the area are also into the same bee as me, most of them, apart from one. And also there's a big apiary quite close by, which is the Mount Edgecombe Black Bee Reserve. So they're doing the same thing. So it all helps to produce the right sort of drones. If you're more limited and you haven't got so many stocks, then you probably will want to boost up the numbers of drones. So you do that by, for example, inserting a comb with drone foundation in, and then they'll draw it out as drones and the queen will lay drones, or put a super frame or two in the brood nest. They'll draw down below it with drone comb, and that's good ways of getting drone numbers up. And that might be particularly important when you're starting up, because you really want to get those good drone numbers up to give yourselves more chance of getting something decent. Now, this is where I am, so I'm a bit lucky in some ways, because I've got a lot of water around me. This is the sea, and this is Plymouth over the water, over Plymouth Sound, and this is the Rhine Peninsula. So it is a slight advantage, but we've all got to look for the advantages in our areas. And it's not perfect, because I know there's people up here who haven't got black bees, and it's only, say, 4 miles, probably about 4 miles as the crow flies, as the bee flies, which isn't enough in theory. You're supposed to have 6-mile radius, but of course I operate usually on about a 3-mile radius as best I can, and that seems to work. Right, actually I'm going on a bit. I don't think that's too many slides now. Right, so using the system outlined above, does it produce what we want? I select my bees for uniform native appearance. The newly reared queens are mated in one area. It's not perfect, and don't expect perfection, but many queens produce offspring of uniform appearance, which is how I judge them. Some of them have been DNA tested and they've been found to be pretty good. It could argue it's to do with dominant and recessive genes, the appearance, but I think, as far as my experience goes, and I'll tell you where my experience is increased, because a couple of years ago we took some bees to a mating apiary on Dartmoor, and we took some drone producing colonies, just 4, which probably isn't enough, but we took about 3 batches of queens up there to mate, and this was supposed to be an isolated mating apiary. The first batch came back really good, and they seemed to be all black bees. What was happening in the mean as we went through the season was it's very poor conditions up here, and either they were feeding, the colonies were declining. The drone rearing colonies were declining because it's such harsh conditions. And by the end of the season, or midway through, they were producing less and less drones. And the second and third batches of queens we took up, they were coming back, and I was getting very disappointed when I saw the offspring, because they weren't black anymore, they were quite yellow. And talking to someone who knows the bees around there, they said, well, it was a bee inspector actually, he didn't tell me where the bees were, but he did tell me there were bees. He knew of 2 or 3 apiaries with different sorts of bees in that area. One was at he did say where one was. It was at Dartmoor Prison. So we knew they had bees at the prison. That was only a mile or 2 away, a couple of miles away. So it immediately showed up. And when they mate within the strain, they look dark. So I think personally, I think the dark appearance is recessive genes, and the yellow appearance is dominant genes. So as soon as you get a yellow in there, it shows up. So we think the native coloration is perhaps recessive, which is brilliant because it gives you a really good indicator of if you're getting good matings or not. Right, selected improvement from mixed stock is difficult because they do not breed true. This is the bit. Breeders always recommend breeding within the subspecies, or at least breeding from crossing two pure strains. And we know this chap speaks about working within a framework, which is a well-defined population, for example, a given race or fairly large local population. You have to decide for yourself what you think's easiest for you. Most of us are starting with very mixed stock, as I did. I stopped bringing all bees into the area, and I kept selecting and selecting. And gradually I got to where I wanted to be in terms of a more consistent stock. And then you can then start to make progress with getting the qualities you want. Right. So the National Bee Improvement Programme is not going to dictate methods that must be used. We want people to work it out for themselves. There's an online guide to help people along with suggestions of queen rearing techniques, record cards, etc., anything you might need to know. And it can be updated and modified as we go along to make a really good help kit for people. And that's going to be continually updated and modified. Just go to BIBBA.com and you'll find the BIBBA website, and you can look up for the NatVip guide. Just a summary of our aims. All beekeepers can benefit from a sustainable system of bee improvement. The aim is to provide an alternative to imports, thus reducing biosecurity risks. The improvement programme is based on stock that we already have, and a combination of natural and artificial selection will allow us to develop a better bee. And don't forget, when I started, it was a case of, can this be done? We don't really know. I had seen it done. I had been to Ireland and seen they were achieving things in Ireland with the native bee. So I knew they could do it, but I didn't know if I could do it on a smaller scale. Since then, my scale has grown, but I started on quite small scale and gradually made progress, so it can be done. Now you can take part in the National Bee Improvement Programme, which we hope you will, in 2 ways, and you'll be fully informed whichever way you choose of what's happening. So you can either join BIBBA for £20 a year, and by the way, BIBBA has got a Facebook page, which I forgot to advertise on here, but I was supposed to, so apologies for that. Or you can sign up as a supporter of the National Bee Improvement Programme for nothing, and you'll be, for signing up, you'll be kept fully informed of all developments. You'll receive a newsletter. I think it's probably once a month, and that will just tell you what's going on. Right. Now I've spoken for an hour, and I probably showed some of these slides next week. I think I'll just go through a couple more quickly. What's the breeding strain? Now that's what we should attain to, I think, and it might be some sort of local breeding strain that you develop yourselves from your own local stock. But it's a strain. A strain is a group of colonies which show uniform or fairly uniform characters and breed true to type. The characters of parents and offspring are generally similar, and that's the important thing. We're trying to get something that will breed true. And that's what breeding true means. It means the parents and offspring are similar, so that you can actually make progress. And they're what I use for my mating queens. They're some are called mini plus nukes. And they're nice because you can overwinter them and get them going in straight away in the spring. And then that's one of the queens we reared. And you've already seen that apiary. That's the book about it. And these are some native bees as we've bred them from mixed stock, basically. And what I look for in a colony is uniformity. They should all look the same, really. And if they don't, I don't normally breed from them because I don't think I'm going to get reliability. They're all going to come out with different characteristics. But that, if I like that queen's characteristics, I like their colony if they're nice and gentle and she's laying brilliantly and there's no chalk brood and all this sort of thing. And I'll probably use her as a breeder queen to rear more stock. And then I'll mate the queen in my mating area. And if they come out looking good again and the characteristics are good, well, basically I'll pick the best ones again. The ones that look uniform and are really docile and what have you. And so the system goes on year. And that's what we hope the National Bee Improvement Programme will do. We hope it will be an ongoing programme that people plug in and it can be improved year on year. We'll all learn from it. We'll all learn better ways of doing it and share our experiences. So everyone who takes part is a part of the programme and just as valuable as anyone else. It's not one person saying, you've got to do it like this. You can, experiment in your own area and see what works and what doesn't work. Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Joe. We've had rather a lot of questions coming in, you'll be pleased to know. First one from Andrew. How long do you need to assess your queens for before deciding on which queens to use for breeder queens?
Yeah, nice question. If you read some of there's loads of books about breeding and so on, and some of them are pretty off-putting really, because they say, oh, you've got to assess them for a season or two, and then you've got to rear some trial offspring and see if they're any good. And then if they are, by that time, you'll know she's a good breeder queen. They can start rearing. By that time, she's probably dead. But what I like to do realistically is, in an ideal world, I will rear queen. The queens I reared last year will be tested in a full season this coming season. So I will be marking them week by week and seeing if they've got the qualities that I want. And then if they have, and they overwinter the next winter, and that's part of the test, is that they overwinter well. So then if they come through beautifully in the spring next year, I will think, excellent, good breeder queen, and I'll rear from her. But in practice, I also, we're often looking for quite a number of breeder queens. I don't like to have it too limited. So you can almost make an instant assessment. It's not as good and not as reliable, but with our record card, we can say, after a couple of times, you can go through lovely temper, lovely brood pattern, looks all healthy. I can see they're going to do well because she's laying beautifully. And I've only tested her for about 3 visits, and each time she's been really lovely. And so if I'm desperate we need a breeder queen, I will rear from her because I've already found she's good. So it's up to you how long you go for. The longer you go, the more reliable it is, but don't go too long, otherwise she'll probably be dead. And it can be done really quickly as well if you need to. So if this is your first season of assessing queens, it doesn't matter. It's something that will stand out and catch your eye. You'll think, right, I'd like to breed from that one because that's standing out as the best one. That's okay to do that. But if you want a more reliable system, you'll test them for a full season.
Excellent. Next question from Colin. What would be a good percentage success rate in queen rearing? He says from egg to productive queen.
You get wastage at every junction, and it's quite disheartening sometimes because you graft, well, this is how we do it. We graft 20 queens, and then we usually get between 12 and 18 is our average. Occasionally it's less. You might only get 6 on one match. You think, what's happened here? But sometimes we get 15 to 18 regularly if the conditions are good. And by conditions being good, I usually mean there's a flow on and there's nectar coming in, there's lots of pollen coming in, and it's perfect for the bees. You can feed them, of course, and it's good to feed them, but I like it best when there's a natural flow on, and I think they're really well fed then. Anyway, so perhaps you get 15, so you've already lost 5. And then what we often do is hatch them in an incubator, and so perhaps only 14 hatch, you lose another one doesn't hatch for some reason. And then if you've got the live virgin queens, you've got to introduce them into we do them in those mini plus nukes, that are larger than a mini nuke, but not as big as a nuke. So we would have to introduce them into those. And there's various ways you can do it. And as far as I can see, none of them are foolproof. So you might lose 2 or 3 again, and it's so disappointing when you see a lovely queen. Perhaps it's more reliable. Sometimes it's more reliable to actually transfer the queen cell to the thing and let it hatch in the hive. The only trouble with that, of course, you don't know if she's hatched or not immediately. So there's swings and roundabouts on both. But anyway, you can lose a couple that way, and then they might be down to about 12 by this time, and then you got to let them mate. So 5 days after they hatched out, they'll probably go out to mate, 5, 6, 7 days, whatever. And some of them just disappear. Some of them are still there. And you go in 2 to 3 weeks later, and they lay pretty quick in these mini nukes. Some of them are laying in within 2 weeks, but I like to leave them 3 weeks if I can, because to be sure. And you go in 3 weeks, and some of them aren't laying. And it's a long route to giving an answer, isn't it? But some of them aren't laying, and you think, what on earth's happened there? And you see her there, and you think, crikey, what's wrong? Why isn't she laying? And you're tempted to give her another week, but of course, you come back in a week's time, and all you see is drone brood. More often than not. If they take a long time to come into lay, it's usually because there's something wrong, and she hasn't mated properly. So there's loss there as well. Anyway, I don't know what the definitive figure is, but I know it comes down pretty rapidly. So I'd say if you get 50% of your original grafts are laying and good, you've done very well, I'd say. I think people often quote a third. But perhaps experts could probably get more. So I think if I got 10 good queens, I'd be happy.
Excellent. Chris, responding to your comments about trying to get commercial operations using non-imported bees, just says bee farmers import queens for an early start.
Yeah.
Can UK beekeepers provide the early queens that they need?
No, that's a good point. It's a fair point. When the queen rearing working group, which DEFRA set up, looked into why people import bees, then one of the factors is that you can get them early and you can get them cheap. They're readily available. And that's something we can't actually do in this country. We can produce them the season before, and we can overwinter them in nukes and so on, so they're ready for the early market. And that's something quite a lot of people do. Of course, the new season ones you import are less likely to swarm. I'm trying to sell you imported queens now, but because they really are new season and they're very young. So our overwintered queens might swarm, but there's good reasons for using our overwintered ones. And what I would say to a bee farmer who likes those early queens is what I said in the talk really. Why don't you set aside part of your enterprise to just try a different system and see what the advantages and disadvantages are? And there are advantages, because you'll be getting bees that you can select and improve, and it's very satisfying to do that. You'll be able to produce stock that you can sell to other beekeepers and so on. But he's quite right. The early market we cannot beat. We can only produce an overwintered queen to compete with it.
Super. Liz asks, is it acceptable to bring in bees that are reared in the same climate, for instance, sea level? So from Northumberland to Mid Wales, for example.
Right. Right. In the National Bee Improvement Programme, we try not to lay down too many rules, but we have said don't import bees because they usually have another subspecies, which doesn't make things any easier. But we have said you can bring in bees from other people in the scheme. In other words, they're following the same rules as you. You're rearing local bees from your best and so on. We're saying you can move bees around in Britain and Ireland. It's a bit of a compromise. And we're not saying we recommend doing that, but we're saying we will accept that. And now beekeepers' attitudes to that are all different. We've all got different attitudes to that. Some think that's fine. Others think if you bring bees in, they should be at least from the same sort of climate or vegetation and stuff. Or some say, well, they should be within a 50-mile radius. So everyone's got a slightly different view. And it's up to the individual beekeepers to work out for themselves what they want to do, or groups to work out what rules they're going to abide by. For myself, I gave up bringing bees in almost entirely. And I just worked with what I've got in this area. And I was lucky to have some fairly good specimens, but very few of them. And all the bees were mixed, I would say, and they probably still are to some extent, but they're much more uniform now. And I have occasionally brought in the odd bee from Cornwall, which I think is considered as a good native stock. So that's about as far as it's gone. So you've got to decide for yourself, really. But we do, within the programme, we do advise only bringing in from people who are abiding by the same selection process of natural and artificial selection, basically, of local stock.
Sorry, I am here. I'm just trying to answer questions at the same time as you're talking. Sorry. But while we're here, I've been asked about a good book to help with queen rearing. I've suggested Principles of Bee Improvement by somebody called Joe Widdicombe. But I wondered if you know of any others that are a good read.
Yeah, that French one. Well, it's in English, luckily. Gilles Fert, F-E-R-T. That came out last year. I find that a very useful book. The BBKA publication on queen rearing is quite good. That's got several different methods. Anything with several different methods is confusing for me, people like me. And I wouldn't recommend something like Snellgrove because he's got about 50 different methods or something ridiculous. And you'll just end up being bamboozled. You only want to look at one or two methods and initially to try those and see what advantage and disadvantage. But that Gilles Fert book, G-I-L-E-S-F-E-R-T, he's great. I can't remember what it's called offhand, but you'll find it if you look up that surname. It's a nice, simple book, and he's very sensible. I like what he says.
Excellent, super. Exeter beekeepers, I don't know if this person speaks on behalf of all beekeepers in Exeter, asks the question, with Varroa global warming, etc., the part of the development of local bees, is annual swarming a positive behaviour for the future? Because they're saying that,
It's a nice question because there's a lot of different views on swarming, and I tried to select those swarming ones, but I could see arguments that don't support that in a way, and Varroa is one of them because I think Varroa naturally selects the bees that swarm. In other words, the bees that swarm stand more chance of survival because they leave their Varroa load behind. There's a break in the brood pattern. There's a break in the brood, so the Varroa can't multiply. It stops them in their tracks, and so the colony hasn't got such a big Varroa load. There's a lot to be said for it, and so someone could make a perfectly good argument for not selecting for that trait. In fact, for favouring the ones that do swarm for those reasons, and I'm not against that. I think that's a valid argument, and if you want to go down that road, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I am supposedly a commercial beekeeper, so I do like to produce honey, and swarming affects your honey production a lot. So I practice swarm control quite rigorously. But, you know, luckily this program, there's lots of different routes within the program, and you can pick and choose your own one. So that's...
Next question from Victoria is, how do you assess for varroa resistance?
Well, actually, that's a good one, but because I haven't done it much. When we started using this system, we decided that selecting for varroa resistance was incredibly complicated and a lot of hard work, and we wanted it to be very simple and quick and the record card quick and easy to use. We don't want to spend half an hour on the record card. We want to spend 30 seconds or a minute at the end of the inspection to fill it in, because we like to get on to the next one. We are supposedly commercial beekeepers, so it's got to be efficient. And we decided not to select for that, but ways in which I am interested in, obviously it's crucial, varroa tolerant bee, whatever words you want to use, are pretty crucial to sustainability of the honeybee. And it's something we want to see our honeybees going down that route. And one thing we are doing is taking, it has to be simple for us to do it. And one thing we're doing is taking certain apiaries out of treatment. So I think there was 3 apiaries last year we didn't treat at all. And we'll just keep those going, and we'll keep breeding from the best survivors in the hope that that will bring up some good results. I've never treated very much for varroa, but I have treated my bees. Normally I've treated them for varroa, and there have been occasions when I haven't, and we've had pretty big catastrophic losses in the region of, well, probably over 50%. You could argue, well, 50% that survive are the great ones that are worth breeding from, and that's the principles we're going to be using for apiaries we take out. Now, there's lots more beekeepers around the country these days who aren't treating their bees for varroa, and I think all well and good if people could get away with it, because that is the way we'll have to go eventually. And probably if we'd gone that way initially, we may have had a massive reduction in bee colonies, but we may be in a different position to what we are now. On the record card, there is you can do mite count. So there's a place for mite count. So you put an insert in 1 week. I recommend putting Vaseline on it and put it underneath a mesh floor and take it out when you come back the next week and count the mites, and then you can divide by 7 if it's a week, and you can put the daily mite count in that box, and you can see how your bees are coping with it. And that's a really good thing to do, because you could, if you want, just treat the bees which are struggling, or what policy you want to do. But I haven't done much myself, I've got to be honest.
And the same person asks about, when should you insert drone foundation in the season? Is it the earliest? Is it temperature? Is it the flow? What dictates?
Yeah, I would think probably, don't forget the drones they take 24 days to hatch out from egg to thingy, and then I think 12 days to mature. So that is for something like 24 and 12. And the queen's got to be, anyway, whatever the maths is, you've got to start quite a long way before you're actually rearing your queens. But the point is, they won't rear them if it's too early, because they don't want to. It's against their principles. But drones usually start being reared sometimes in March, but usually April. So probably get it in, and they've got to draw a comb out if you're giving them foundation, or even if you're giving them a super comb, they've got to draw the comb out below it. So April's a good time to get that in on a fairly vigorous colony. On a feeble colony, it's not. I wouldn't do it. You've got to wait till the colony is starting to expand nicely, and then it can cope with dealing with drones. So it needs to be quite a strong colony. So that's probably when you want to do it, and bear that in mind when you're with your queen rearing, get the timing right. As I say, I don't practice that now because we've got so many colonies in the area. We're lucky. I just leave it to the bees to which colonies will rear what they want. And I work on the principle that good, strong colonies, which are what I want, will rear the most drones. So I'm getting a natural selection going on there. The drones are going to be from good, strong colonies. So something good's happening. But I do appreciate that people do need to rear more drones, especially if the numbers are low. You know, numbers of colonies are low around there. So I would start in April. Bees don't always do what you want. That was one of the hassles I had with drone rearing. They you put a frame foundation in and they'd ignore it. For example, another lot would do it, but sometimes they ignore it and all this sort of thing. It's quite difficult, quite tricky, but feeding will probably help to stimulate them.
And then we've had a couple of questions about the mini nukes that you use, the mini plus nukes.
Yeah, that's sometimes called mini plus nukes. They're 6-frame nukes. These are, I should get commission really because I keep advertising, but a Bellow near York sell them, and that's where I bought mine. And they're really useful because overwintering is a major bonus. Getting them started is a bit of a pain because you've got to put a starter strip of foundation in each one, and you've got to put a litre of bees in each one. It's quite a lot of bees to find, but you put them in, you lock them in for a few days with a feed on top, and then you let them out after 2 or 3 days, and they draw the comb out and so on. And once they're established, they're great. So it was a bit painful the first year because we had to do so many of them, but now we just overwinter them. So, and you can double them up on double and brood boxes. Then you can split the brood boxes. You can actually split them into they're 6 frames, but you can run them as 2 3-frame nukes if you wish. We haven't tried that yet, but you get supplied with a partition, polystyrene partition. So you split 2 colonies and there's 2 entrances. And you can put a queen cell in each one then to get mated. So they're really versatile and excellent. The feeders are very useful. You just pour it in on top. And they're dead easy to use.
And a supplementary question to that was, how do you get them onto normal frames? But I presume you just use them mating nukes, so you don't need to get the bees onto normal size.
Right. To get them into a normal nuke, for example, you actually you catch the queen, you take her out, put her in a cage, and introduce her to a nuke, and then you put a new queen cell into the hive if that's what you're doing. So, or you know, if you haven't got a new queen, you could unite the queenless mini nuke with another one, just stick it on top of another one with newspaper, so that you know they're quite flexible. You can do all sorts of things with them, but you don't actually. The frames are smaller than a national; they're only half size, so they're not much use. They're not interchangeable with anything. So it's just a case of taking the queen out and introducing her.
Super. Well, I think that's about it. Kevin, who's a bee farmer, says, would you leave the drone frame in all season? Because he wonders whether or not that would knock the colony out of balance with too many drones in there.
Yeah, this was one of the things I didn't like about the method of messing about with drone comb and stuff, because I like the colonies to do what they want, really. And I never knew when they'd take them out, when to put them in. And yeah, I think by all means take them out. Certainly if you think there's enough drones in the area, you can take them out. And it's better for the colony to just do what they want, isn't it, than to keep forcing them to rear loads of drones. It's a decision you have to make. It's a tricky one.
Super. Well, that's it. We're on nearly 9 o'clock, so we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Joe.
Okay, thank you very much for listening, everybody.